When we talk about the turning points of World War II, we often think of massive battles, powerful armies, and vast strategies stretching across continents. But sometimes, the true pivot of history can be traced to the minds of two commanders whose decisions shaped the fate of millions. Georgy Zhukov and Heinz Guderian, two names forged in fire, discipline, and warfare, stood at opposite ends of the Eastern Front, each driven by an uncompromising belief in his own doctrine. One embodied relentless resilience, the other lightning-fast aggression. And when their strategic visions finally collided in the struggle for Moscow, the future of the world hung in the balance. This is the story of a clash deeper than battlefield maneuvers or military ranks. It is the story of two military architects whose ideas, instincts, and leadership styles redefined modern warfare. Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's iron-willed strategist, carved his path through sheer discipline, operational depth, and an unshakable understanding of defensive endurance. Jens Guderian, the father of the German Blitzkrieg, believed victory belonged to those who moved fastest, struck hardest, and shattered enemy lines before they could respond. As Operation Barbarossa unfolded and the German advance carved a brutal arc toward Moscow, these two commanders found themselves locked in a contest of speed versus depth, boldness versus resilience, and theory versus survival. Their decisions would not only determine the outcome of the Eastern Front, they would help decide the ultimate direction of World War II itself. To understand why the clash between Georgy Zhukov and Heinz Guderian became one of the decisive turning points of World War II, we must first understand the worlds that shaped them, the doctrines they crafted, and the paths that led them toward an inevitable strategic collision. These two men did not simply command armies, they embodied two competing visions of warfare forged by the tragedies, revolutions, and ideological storms of the early 20th century. Their backgrounds reveal not only their military brilliance, but also the stark contrast between the Soviet and German war machines they came to represent. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was born in 1896 into a poor peasant family in Russia, a background defined by hardship, physical labor, and an early exposure to the unforgiving realities of rural life. Unlike many of his German counterparts, Zhukov did not emerge from a noble military tradition. Instead, he built himself through sheer determination and discipline. His introduction to military life began in World War I when he served in the Imperial Russian Cavalry. There, he quickly learned the value of endurance, precise execution, and the necessity of maintaining composure under pressure. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Zhukov joined the Red Army and steadily rose through the ranks due to his unshakable loyalty, tactical sharpness, and ability to execute difficult orders without hesitation. His defining pre-World War II moment came in 1939 at Khalkhin Gol, where he crushed the Japanese Sixth Army with a perfectly coordinated combination of tanks, artillery, and infantry. This victory was decisive enough to convince Stalin that Zhukov was a commander capable of turning the tide of war even with limited resources and under extreme pressure. It also cemented Zhukov's belief in deep operations, layered defenses, and the strategic use of reserves principles that would later prove essential during the German invasion. Heinz Wilhelm Guderian, on the other hand, emerged from a very different world. Born in 1888 into a Prussian military family, Guderian grew up in an environment that valued discipline, hierarchy, and professional military study. He entered the Imperial German Army before World War I and served in signals and communications a role that, ironically, prepared him for the future far more than he could have imagined. The chaos, trench warfare, and stagnation of the First World War convinced him that the future of combat lay not in slow-moving infantry lines, but in mechanization, mobility, and rapid breakthroughs. After the war, during Germany's turbulent interwar period, Guderian became obsessed with armored warfare. He devoured foreign military research, studied British tank experiments, and relentlessly pushed for a radical overhaul of German doctrine. His book, Asterisk Achtung Panzer, Asterisk, laid the intellectual foundation for Blitzkrieg operational concept built on speed, shock, concentrated armor thrusts, and psychological domination. Unlike Zhukov, who forged his ideas in the brutal expanses of the Soviet frontier, Guderian shaped his doctrine in classrooms, strategic debates, and mechanized war simulations. By the time Adolf Hitler sought to rebuild the German military, Guderian had become indispensable. His ideas led to sweeping victories in Poland and France, cementing his reputation as Europe's premier armored commander. Thus, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, these two men were already giants within their respective military structures. One, the architect of Soviet defensive resilience. The other, the spearhead of German mechanized assault. Their backgrounds defined their philosophies. Zhukov believed in absorbing the blow, stabilizing the line, and then unleashing overwhelming counterforce. Guderian believed in hitting fast enough that no counterforce could ever form. Their paths were shaped by geography, ideology, and circumstance, but the Eastern Front would bring these philosophies into direct conflict. And when the German advance drove toward Moscow, the strategies conceived by these two commanders became the invisible forces guiding millions of soldiers. Their backgrounds were no longer just personal histories. They became the foundations upon which the fate of World War II would be decided. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, it was not simply another military campaign. It was the greatest land invasion in human history, and it represented Adolf Hitler's boldest, most reckless gamble. At the forefront of this offensive was Heinz Guderian and his Panzergruppe II, an armored force designed to carve open the Soviet Union with the same speed and shock that had toppled Poland and France. Guderian's tanks surged across the frontier with blistering momentum, slicing through Soviet defenses that were crippled by confusion, poor communications, and the paralysis inflicted by Stalinist refusal to believe the invasion was real until it was too late. In the early weeks, it seemed as though Guderian's doctrine of lightning warfare was operating at peak efficiency. His armored spearheads encircled massive Soviet formations at Minsk and Smolensk, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and destroying vast stockpiles of equipment. German officers declared the Soviet Union already defeated, and Berlin began discussing post-war territorial partitions. Yet beneath the surface of this apparent triumph, cracks were forming, cracks that Guderian could sense but could not repair. While Guderian drove east with confidence, Georgy Zhukov found himself facing the greatest military disaster his nation had ever experienced. The Red Army was collapsing across multiple fronts. Command structures were fragmented, and many units lacked even basic ammunition. Zhukov, who had warned Stalin about the vulnerability of the southwestern flank, was furious when his recommendation to withdraw from Kiev was rejected. Stalin's refusal to retreat resulted in another massive encirclement, costing the Soviets nearly 500,000 soldiers. Though reassigned, Zhukov took this moment as an affirmation of his strategic instincts. The Germans were not unstoppable, but the Soviets needed coordinated defense in depth, functional reserves, and a leadership structure that could act decisively without political interference. His understanding of the German operational tempo was sharper than almost any other Soviet commander, and he quickly recognized that Germany's advance, though explosive, ultimately unsustainable without the logistical backbone required for a long-term campaign. As Guderian pushed deeper toward Moscow, his operations began meeting increasing resistance not only from the Soviet army, but from the vastness of Russian geography itself. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Fuel shortages forced tanks to halt for hours, sometimes days. Mechanical breakdowns became routine as engines and treads wore out over hundreds of kilometers. Still, Guderian pressed forward, believing that the momentum of Blitzkrieg could not be interrupted without risking the collapse of the entire campaign. Meanwhile, Zhukov was rapidly consolidating defensive positions around Moscow, reinforcing weak sectors, reorganizing shattered units, and demanding strict discipline from his officers. Though he had not yet taken command of the Moscow front, his influence was already reshaping Soviet operational thinking. The German advance continues toward Moscow, but its tempo is slowing. Soviet defenses are stiffening, and the collision between Guderian's speed-based doctrine and Zhukov's depth-oriented strategy is now unavoidable. The stage is set for one of the most consequential strategic confrontations of the war. As summer turned to autumn in 1941, the German High Command shifted its attention toward what it believed would be the decisive blow of the campaign, the capture of Moscow. The city was not only the capital of the Soviet Union, but the psychological and logistical heart of the Soviet state. Hitler assumed that its fall would plunge the USSR into chaos, forcing Stalin to negotiate or retreat into the Asian interior. For this final thrust, Heinz Guderian and his armored forces were expected to play a central role. Yet even before Operation Typhoon Germany's offensive against Moscow officially began, Guderian was growing increasingly frustrated with the operational interference from Hitler and the Oberkommando des Heers. The decision to divert his forces south toward Kiev had cost the Germans precious time and fuel, and worst of all, it allowed Zhukov and the Soviets to reorganize the Central Front. Guderian believed that if the original momentum toward Moscow had been preserved, the city might have already fallen. With the launch of Operation Typhoon in October, Guderian's tanks once again surged forward, achieving initial breakthroughs and creating large encirclements around Vyazma and Bryansk. These victories were tactically impressive, but strategically deceptive. Each encirclement exhausted German manpower, stretched supply lines further, and forced Guderian's units to occupy more territory than they could reasonably control. Meanwhile, the Rasputitsa-Russia's infamous autumn mud brought armored mobility nearly to a standstill. Tanks sank into roads that had become rivers of sludge, trucks bogged down, and aircraft were grounded by poor weather. It became increasingly clear that the German operational infrastructure was not built for a campaign of this scale. During this same period, Georgy Zhukov re-entered the narrative with overwhelming authority. Stalin appointed him commander of the Western Front, placing Moscow's defense directly under his control. Zhukov immediately began implementing a multi-layered defensive strategy focused on trading space for time, holding key terrain, and preserving operational flexibility. Unlike the earlier weeks of Barbarossa, where Soviet units often fought to the death without strategic coherence, Zhukov ensured that withdrawals were orderly, counterattacks were purposeful, and reserves were positioned for maximum impact. He understood that Moscow could not be defended by brute force alone. It required a coordinated defense, designed to slow, bleed, and ultimately exhaust the advancing German formations. The opposing doctrines clashed most visibly through their contrasting treatment of time. Guderian viewed time as a resource to be consumed. He believed every hour loss meant the death of momentum. Zhukov viewed time as a weapon, one that could transform German speed into German vulnerability. As temperatures dropped and the first snow fell, the weaknesses of blitzkrieg in harsh conditions became brutally visible. German fuel froze in tanks, weapons malfunctioned, and troops lacked proper winter clothing. Zhukov exploited these conditions with calculated precision, reinforcing choke points, launching localized counterattacks, and steadily thickening Moscow's defensive ring. Guderian's panzers are battered, cold, and overextended, while Zhukov's defenses are hardening, coordinated, and growing in number. The climax is approaching the moment when winter, doctrine, and leadership converge. By late November 1941, the German advance toward Moscow had reached its critical limit. Guderian's forces, once unstoppable, now found themselves fighting not only the Red Army, but the natural forces of the Russian winter. Temperatures dropped to levels no German unit had been prepared for. Fuel thickened, lubricants froze, and tank engines shrieked in the cold. Soldiers suffered frostbite, clothing stiffened like armor, and rifles jammed at the moment they were most needed. Despite these conditions, Guderian pushed relentlessly toward the city of Tula, seeking the final breakthrough that he believed would end the Soviet resistance. Yet the closer he came, the more fiercely the Soviets fought, guided by Zhukov's understanding that the German offensive was nearing exhaustion. Zhukov's defensive system around Moscow was not the simple, static line the Germans expected. Instead, it was a complex network of fallback positions, fortified nodes, trenches, and reserve concentrations. He used his troops efficiently, refusing to waste them on hopeless stands, and ensured that supplies, while limited, were distributed in a way that prioritized critical sectors. When German units attempted to break through, they encountered not isolated defense, but layered resistance designed to slow their advance to a crawl. Even when Guderian captured towns and strong points, he found that the Soviet defensive depth forced him to restart the costly process again and again. It was here that Zhukov's doctrine of attrition, resilience, and depth demonstrated its full power. Meanwhile, reinforcements from Siberia, freed by Soviet intelligence confirming that Japan would not attack from the east, began arriving near Moscow. These fresh divisions, hardened by extreme climates and well-equipped for winter, were positioned strategically by Zhukov in preparation for the moment when the German advance would finally stall. Guderian, recognizing the growing crisis, repeatedly requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. But Hitler refused, insisting that no retreat would be tolerated. This rigid interference further undermined the German operational situation and placed Guderian in a position where tactical sense conflicted with political orders. By early December, the German offensive reached total paralysis. Exhaustion, attrition, and the brutal winter had overwhelmed the strengths of Blitz. Zhukov sensed the opportunity with the instincts of a commander who understood both the enemy and the terrain. On December 5th, he launched a massive counteroffensive along a broad front, hitting Guderian's weakened units with a ferocity they could no longer withstand. The Soviet attack forced the Germans into their first major retreat of the war. Hitler was enraged, blaming his commanders for the failure while ignoring the impossible conditions and strategic overreach that he himself had engineered. For Guderian, the retreat marked the end of his decisive battlefield influence. He argued with Hitler, protested the unrealistic demands, and soon found himself dismissed from command. Zhukov, by contrast, emerged as the savior of Moscow, the commander who had broken the myth of German invincibility. Act 3 ends with a dramatic shift. The Soviets are no longer simply surviving, they are seizing initiative. The clash between Zhukov and Guderian around Moscow was not a brief confrontation, nor was it defined by a single battle or moment. Instead, it represented the collision of two military worldviews whose consequences shaped the remainder of World War II. After the German retreat from Moscow, it became clear that Blitzkrieg, though effective in Western Europe, had met its match on the limitless steppes of the Soviet Union. Guderian's doctrine depended on momentum, surprise, fuel, communications, and aggressive tempo. All five of these pillars collapsed during the winter of 1941. Blitzkrieg could break armies, but it could not break an entire nation fighting for survival. Nor could it overcome the unforgiving Russian climate and the vast distances that slowed even the fastest mechanized forces. Guderian's removal from frontline command reflected the failure not of his tactical brilliance, but of the strategic assumptions behind the Barbarossa plan itself. Zhukov, meanwhile, emerged from the Moscow campaign not just as a skilled general but as the central architect of Soviet military recovery. His success in defending the capital cemented his role as Stalin's most trusted commander, leading to his involvement in future turning points such as Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kursk, and ultimately the Battle of Berlin. The depth-oriented, shock-resilient doctrine he championed became the backbone of Soviet strategy for the rest of the war. Zhukov demonstrated that wars of attrition, when combined with strategic foresight, could overcome even technologically superior and operationally innovative foes. His style was often brutally efficient, demanding immense sacrifices from his troops. But it was precisely this uncompromising approach that enabled the Soviet Union to survive its darkest hour. The legacies of both commanders extended beyond the war. Guderian, though dismissed, returned later as inspector of armored troops in 1943, attempting reforms that came too late. After the war, he wrote extensively, arguing that political interference, not doctrinal flaws, caused Germany's defeat. His writings influenced post-war armored doctrine across NATO nations, solidifying his reputation as the father of modern mechanized warfare. Zhukov's post-war legacy, however, was more complex. Though initially celebrated as a hero, he later fell out of favor with Stalin, who feared the popularity and independence of his most successful general. Still, Zhukov's reputation endured, and he remains widely regarded as one of the greatest commanders of the 20th century. This strategic clash between Zhukov and Guderian left a profound historical imprint. Their doctrines embodied two approaches to modern war: rapid maneuver versus strategic depth, decisive battles versus protracted resilience, operational shock versus industrial endurance. The Battle of Moscow demonstrated that wars are won not just by clever maneuvers or superior technology, but by the ability to adapt, persevere, and exploit the weaknesses of even the most formidable opponents. Act 4 closes with the recognition that their confrontation was not merely military, it was philosophical, and the doctrine that prevailed helped shape the world we live in today.